My name is Lena Vasquez. I am 26 years old. And I want to tell you about the Tuesday afternoon when I found out that the version of events my parents had been selling to everyone around us, including me, had a paper trail. And that the paper trail told a completely different story than they did. I want to tell you what I did when I found that out. I want to tell you what it took. And I want to tell you what happened after, not in the dramatic, condensed way that stories sometimes get told, where consequences arrive like weather, all at once and from a single direction, but in the slow and specific way that things actually unfold when you are 16 years old and you have just understood something about the people who raised you that cannot be ununderstood. But first I need to go back. Because none of this makes sense without understanding what kind of family I came from and what kind of daughter I had learned to be inside it before I understood that learning had been deliberate. I was the oldest of 3 children. My brother Daniel was 2 years younger than me, and my sister B was 6 years younger. We grew up in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, in a house that looked from the outside exactly the way a family home is supposed to look. There was a vegetable garden in the back that my mother kept with genuine care from the first week of April through the last week of October every year, staked and labeled and tended. There were photographs on the walls in matching frames. My father coached Daniel's soccer team for 3 seasons when Daniel was in elementary school, and people in our neighborhood used to stop him at the gas station to say what a great dad he was, and he would accept the compliment with a kind of warmth that I recognized even then as performance, though I did not have that word for it yet. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because I spent a long time trying to decide whether what my parents did to me was calculated or whether it was simply the natural expression of how they understood family, which is to say, how they understood me. I have reached a conclusion about that, but it took years, and I will get to it. The first thing you need to know is that my mother had been ill, in varying degrees of severity, for most of my childhood. She had a connective tissue disorder that caused her significant pain, particularly in her hands and her lower back, and that made certain physical tasks genuinely difficult for her on her worst days. She had been formally diagnosed when I was 9 years old, though the symptoms had been present for longer than that. I remember the year before the diagnosis as a year of specialist appointments and waiting rooms and the particular tension of a household that is holding its breath. I do not dispute that her condition was real. I watched her suffer. I loved her. I wanted to help her. I think that is an important thing to say plainly. I was not a reluctant daughter. I was a willing one. I cooked dinner starting around age 11 because I wanted to. I helped with laundry. I got B ready for school in the mornings because my mother's hands were bad on those days and my father left early for work, and it seemed like the obvious thing to do. I packed lunches. I helped Daniel with homework on Tuesday and Thursday nights because those were the nights my mother took her heavier medication and was not fully present by 7 p.m. I did not think of any of it as unusual. I thought of it as what you did when someone you loved needed help. What I did not understand at 11 or at 13 or even at 15 was that my willingness had become, in my parents' minds, a permanent and renewable resource. That my help had stopped being a gift I was giving and had become instead a fixed line item in a household budget I had never agreed to fund. That they had looked at what I gave freely and had quietly, without ceremony, reclassified it as something I owed. I understand it now. The school year I turned 16 was a difficult one. My mother's condition had worsened over the previous winter in ways that were measurable and documented. She had been hospitalized twice between October and January, the first time for 4 days and the second time for 11. The second hospitalization ended on January 8th. She came home thinner than she had left, moving more carefully, with new prescriptions and a follow-up schedule and a specialist's assessment that the next 12 months would require significant modification of her daily activity level. My father worked long hours. He was a shift supervisor at a distribution facility about 40 minutes from our house, which meant he left at 5:45 a.m. most mornings and was not reliably home before 7 p.m. Some weeks, he worked Saturdays. The hours were genuinely the structure of his job. I am not inventing a villain for this part of the story. The commute was real. The exhaustion was real. By the time he arrived home most evenings, the dinner I had made was on the table, and the kitchen was already cleaned up, and B had been bathed, and Daniel had been through his homework, and my mother had been given her 6 p.m. medication with a glass of water, and whatever she was eating that day, because some days her appetite was almost nothing, and you had to find the things she would accept. I was doing all of that. I had been doing all of that in varying degrees for years. What changed in the winter I was 16 was the scale and the consistency. My mother's bad days were no longer occasional. They were the baseline. And I had adapted to them the way I had always adapted, by expanding what I was willing to carry. What I did not know was that my parents had looked at that expansion and had decided to formalize it, to make it structural, to make it, in the most literal possible sense, official. I want to tell you something about that school year before I go further because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I was a junior. AP Chemistry, AP English Literature, and an advanced mathematics elective that my guidance counselor, Ms. Patricia Odom, had specifically recommended after I scored in the top 3% of my class on a statewide standardized exam the previous spring. My cumulative GPA at the end of my sophomore year was 3.94. I had been identified the previous fall by the district's academic enrichment coordinator as a candidate for an early college partnership program at the state university, a program that would allow eligible juniors to take credited university courses during their senior year, tuition covered, with the credits transferable upon matriculation. Ms. Odom had written me a letter of support for that application in November. She had mailed it to our house because the program required a copy for the student's file. My mother had left the letter on the kitchen counter, still in its opened envelope, and my father had picked it up one evening at around 6:30 p.m. and read it while standing at the counter waiting for the kettle to boil. He read the whole thing. I watched him read it. He set it back down without commenting and poured his tea, and went to the other room. Ms. Odom had written in that letter that she believed I was one of the most academically promising students she had worked with in 14 years of teaching. She had written that my capacity for independent reasoning and structured self-direction were qualities that appeared, in her professional judgment, to be genuinely exceptional rather than merely strong. She had written those things in a letter that went to her house, and that my father read at 6:30 p.m. on a Thursday in November. I am telling you this not to establish that I was exceptional. I am telling you this because I need you to understand what was already in the room when my parents had the conversation I was not part of. They knew what I was working toward. They had read it, in someone else's careful professional language, on school letterhead. And they made their decision anyway. Before I tell you what I found on those forms, and what was on them that could not have been put there by me, I want to ask you something. Whatever the light looks like outside wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, whatever season, were you the kind of child who was told that your future was the priority? Or were you the kind who learned, slowly and without anyone ever saying it directly, that your future was negotiable? That it was something that could be adjusted when the household required it? I ask because I want you to know before I go further that I spent a long time thinking the answer to that question was simply the way families worked. It is not. And if you are sitting somewhere right now recognizing something in what I am describing, I want you to keep listening. The call from Ms. Odom came on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. I was at home. I had stayed home that day because B had a low fever, 100.3 degrees when I took it at 7:15 a.m., and my mother's hands were bad enough that morning that she had not been able to manage the buttons on her own cardigan, and I had helped her with them before making breakfast, and by the time I had assessed the situation it had seemed more practical to keep B home and stay with her than to arrange the alternative. I had done this before. Missed a day, caught up, moved on. It had always been fine. Ms. Odom called at 2:17 p.m. I remember the time because I had just put B down for a nap and had come back to the kitchen table where I was working through the chapter on reaction kinetics in my AP Chemistry textbook. I had a glass of water on the table and my notes spread across 3 pages, and I was calculating whether I could finish the chapter before I needed to start dinner at 5:30. She asked if I had a moment. I said yes. She said she was calling because my file had been flagged that morning by the attendance office, and she wanted to check in with me directly before doing anything else. She said it in the particular tone of a person who is trying not to alarm you while they assess how alarmed they themselves should be. She told me that according to the district's official records, I had been withdrawn from Haverford High School. The withdrawal had been processed on February 9th. The stated reason on the documentation was family medical necessity. The forms had been signed by a parent and, according to the records, by me. I did not say anything for a moment. She asked if I was still there. I said yes. Asked her to email me the forms. She said she would need to confirm with the district office whether the documents could be forwarded given that they were official enrollment records and that she would call me back. I said I understood and asked her to please do it as quickly as she could. She said she would call me within the hour. I set the phone down on the kitchen table. I sat there for approximately 4 minutes looking at the clock on the microwave because I needed something specific and fixed to orient myself to. The clock read 2:21 p.m. when I stopped looking at it. I picked up my pen and wrote the time at the top of a clean page of my notebook. Then I went to find my father. My father was in the living room watching a home improvement program with the volume at about half. My mother was in her room. I went to my father because he was the available one and because I was trying, consciously and deliberately, to be methodical rather than emotional about this, a way of moving through difficult situations that I had developed over years without having a name for it. I told him that Ms. Odom had called. I told him what she had said, in sequence, without inflection. I watched his face while I spoke. He did not look surprised. I want to be precise about this because I came back to it many times when I was reconstructing the sequence of events from a position of having more information. His face did not register confusion or alarm. It registered something else. What I would now describe as the rapid internal calibration of a person deciding which version of a prepared story to deploy. He chose the version in which I was confused. He said, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded across his chest in a loose, casual way, in a tone of complete and deliberate calm, "You signed the forms yourself. We witnessed it. Stop making things up." I said I had not signed any forms. He said that he and my mother had discussed the home situation with me in January, that I had indicated I understood the household needed adjustment, and that the withdrawal paperwork had been a formal mechanism for making that arrangement official with the school district. I said again that I had not signed any forms, that I had not been shown any forms, that I had not agreed to withdraw from school. He said I was being dramatic and that we could talk about it again once I had settled down, and then he turned back toward the television. The conversation was over, from his perspective. He had closed the door on it with the same calm efficiency with which he had opened it. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I registered the fact that he had not looked at me again. Then I went back to the kitchen table and waited for Ms. Odom to call back. She called at 3:44 p.m. The district office had approved the release of copies of the withdrawal documentation to me as the named student. She said she was emailing them now. She said, in careful language, that if I had any concerns about the content of the records, there were established processes for addressing them, and that she was available to walk me through those processes. She was being deliberate with what she was and wasn't saying. I think by that point she had already spoken to someone in the district office who had said something that sharpened her concern, though she did not tell me that on that call. The email arrived at 4:02 p.m. 3 attachments. I opened the first one. I looked at the signature line for a long time. My signature has a specific and consistent characteristic that I have had since I started signing my name in middle school. The capital L in my last name loops slightly backward, a leftward curl at the top that is the opposite of a standard forward-facing L. It is distinctive enough that people who are familiar with my handwriting notice it. The signature on the form had an L. It was even, forward-facing, and unremarkable. It looked like someone who had studied my signature from a limited sample, perhaps from a permission slip or a school form from a few years earlier, without having seen it frequently enough to catch the detail that would have given it away. The date on the first form was February 7th. I had been in Portland on February 7th. I had been in Portland from February 5th through February 8th, staying with my mother's sister, my Aunt Rosa, while she recovered from outpatient knee surgery that she had undergone on February 4th. The trip had been arranged by my parents. They had driven me to the bus station at 6:20 a.m. on February 5th, and I had arrived in Portland at 10:45 a.m. I had a paper bus ticket with my name and the date printed on it. I had a receipt from a pharmacy 2 blocks from my aunt's apartment, time-stamped February 6th at 3:17 p.m. for a prescription I had picked up on her behalf. I had text messages sent from my phone over 4 days that were time-stamped with a Portland area carrier signal. I had not been in our city on February 7th or 8th. I could not have signed anything on February 7th. My parents, who had driven me to the bus station, knew that. Something inside me went very still. I want to be precise about what that stillness was, because it is easy to describe it incorrectly, and the incorrect description would make what came after seem more dramatic than it felt. It was not shock. It was not rage. It was not grief, though grief was in it somewhere, folded underneath. It was the stillness of a conclusion being reached. The kind of stillness that happens not at the beginning of understanding but at the end of it, when the last piece of information arrives and the shape of the thing becomes complete and there is nowhere left for uncertainty to live. I sat at the kitchen table in the house where I had spent my entire life, with 3 scanned documents open on my laptop and the sound of a television coming from the living room and be asleep down the hall, and the AP Chemistry chapter still open to page 247. And I understood with a specific and irreversible clarity of a documented fact that my parents had decided to redirect my future without my consent, and that when the mechanics of that redirection had required a signature they did not have, they had provided one themselves. I forwarded the email to my personal account. I took screenshots of all 3 forms and saved them to a folder I created on my laptop and labeled with the date. I opened the notes application on my phone and wrote down, in order, the time of Ms. Odom's first call, the time of her second call, the time the email arrived, the specific discrepancy in the signature, and the full documentation I had available to establish my location on the dates in question. I wrote it in the plain, sequential language I used for lab reports. Subject, observation, evidence, conclusion. Then I went and started dinner because Bea would be awake from her nap within the hour and she would be hungry, and she was 6 years old, and none of this was something she needed to be part of. My father came into the kitchen at 5:50 p.m., opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of water, looked at the pot on the stove.
He did not speak.
I did not speak. We moved around each other in the way people do when a difficult thing is sitting between them and neither has decided how to handle it yet. My mother came to the table at 6:10 p.m. She ate a small amount. She asked Bea about her day. She did not look at me for longer than a moment at a time. I ate my dinner, cleared the table, ran Bea's bath at 7:30 p.m., read her 2 chapters, turned out her light at 8:15 p.m. Then I came back to the kitchen table and worked through my AP Chemistry chapter until 11 p.m. because I had decided, with a quiet finality of that stillness, that the withdrawal was not a conclusion. It was an interruption. There is a meaningful difference between those 2 things, and I intended to hold it. At 7:51 a.m. the following morning, I called Ms. Odom before the school day began. I told her I had reviewed all 3 forms. I told her that the signatures on the forms were not mine. I described the specific discrepancy, the forward-facing L versus the characteristic backward curl of my actual signature, and then I told her about the Portland trip. I told her the dates. I told her what documentation I had. I gave her this information in the same sequential, organized way I had written it in my phone the night before. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. Then she said, "Lena, I want to be very careful about the words I use here. But I think what you're describing constitutes document fraud, and I want you to know that the district has a process for exactly this kind of situation." She was the first person to use that word. I had been thinking it since 4:02 p.m. the previous afternoon, but I had not said it out loud yet, and there was something significant about hearing it said by an adult in a professional context, stated plainly and without hedging. It made the thing more real. It also, in a way I had not expected, made it less frightening because a thing with a name has a process attached to it, and processes are navigable. Ms. Odom asked me to give her until the end of the day. She said she would be making some calls and would have more information for me by 4 p.m. She said, before she hung up, that I should not destroy or delete anything, any documentation, any records, any messages. I told her I had already been organizing everything I had. She said, "Good. That's exactly right." I spent that day at home. My mother was having a difficult morning, and Bea still had a residual cough, and staying was the pragmatic choice. But I was not idle. At 10:30 a.m. I walked the 4 blocks to the public library and printed all 3 forms for 37 cents. I bought a manila envelope and folder at the library supply kiosk for 89 cents. I organized the printed copies with the bus ticket, the pharmacy receipt, and a printed text message history. I wrote a cover page listing the contents and the date. I was back home by 11:15 a.m. My parents said nothing to me that entire day about any of it. Ms. Odom called at 4:23 p.m. She told me the district office had initiated a formal review of the withdrawal documentation. She said a meeting had been scheduled for March 1st and that the district's legal compliance coordinator, a man named Robert Anand, would be present. She told me my parents would be formally notified of the meeting and asked to attend. She told me one more thing before she hung up. She said it carefully, in the way that careful people say things they have chosen precisely. Lena, I want you to know that I have provided the district office with a written account of your academic record and the conversation I had with you this afternoon. And I want you to know that I am in your corner. I thanked her. I meant it in a way that was larger than the words, but I did not have a better way to say it. So I said it simply, and I held on to what she had said for the rest of that evening. The meeting on March 1st was held at the district administrative office, in a conference room on the second floor with fluorescent lighting and a table that seated 8. Ms. Odom arrived at 8:47 a.m. Robert Anand arrived at 8:50 a.m. My parents arrived at 9:12 a.m., 12 minutes after the scheduled start time. I had been there since 8:40 a.m., with my manila folder on the table in front of me. Robert Anand was a compact, methodical man in his mid-50s with the manner of someone who has spent a long career dealing with situations other people find overwhelming and that he finds simply procedural. He opened the meeting by explaining the district's document review process in neutral, administrative language. Then he placed printed copies of the withdrawal forms on the table, one set facing my parents, one set facing me, and asked my father, directly and by name, to confirm that the signatures on the documents were genuine. My father said yes. Robert Anand then placed a fourth document on the table. It was a written statement from my Aunt Rosa, printed on her personal letterhead, attesting that I had been present at her home in Portland, Oregon from the evening of February 5th through the morning of February 8th. Attached to it was a copy of my bus ticket. Behind it were 3 pages of time-stamped text messages. He placed them in front of my parents without commentary and waited. The room was very quiet for a period of time that I estimated at approximately 30 seconds, but that felt longer than that. My father looked at the documents. He looked at my mother. My mother was looking at her hands on the table. She had the particular stillness of a person who has run out of the version of events that works. My father said, after a moment, that there must have been some confusion about the dates, that the forms might have been prepared earlier and dated later due to an administrative error, that he would need to review his records at home. Robert Anand said he understood, and that the district would also be reviewing its records, and that the documentation would be referred to the district's Legal Compliance Council for further evaluation. He said this in an even, unhurried tone. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The meeting ended at 11:23 a.m. My parents left without speaking to me. I stayed for 11 more minutes to give Robert Anand my contact information and a copy of the folder I had assembled. He took it, looked at the cover page I had written, and said, "This is organized. That will be helpful." The district's fraud investigator was a woman named Carol Hensley, who split her time across 3 school districts in the county. She called at 9:15 a.m. on March 3rd to tell me that a formal investigative file had been opened and to schedule an initial interview. We spoke for 47 minutes on March 5th, starting at 2 p.m. I gave her the complete sequence of events in chronological order. She took notes in a spiral notebook and asked me twice to slow down so she could catch a specific date or number. At the end of the interview, she told me I should continue to preserve all documentation and notify her immediately if my parents made any contact that felt coercive. I asked, directly, what the possible outcomes were. She said she could not speak to that yet, but that the district took document irregularities of this nature very seriously and that my academic record would be protected during the review. I re-enrolled on March 17th. The processing had taken 14 days from the date Carol Hensley's file was opened. I received the confirmation email at 3:47 p.m., and I read it standing in the kitchen of my parents' house. I was still living there, which was its own specific kind of difficulty that I will not fully describe except to say that those 14 days were very long and very quiet and involved a great deal of deliberate, effortful ordinariness from all parties. And I felt something release in my chest that I had not consciously known I was holding. I was back in class on March 18th, a Thursday. Ms. Odom met me outside her office at 7:40 a.m. She handed me a printed copy of my updated schedule and a small folded note. The note said in her handwriting, "Welcome back. The chemistry teacher has your makeup packet. You have not missed anything you cannot recover." I stood in the hallway outside her door and read it twice. Then I folded it along its crease and put it in the front pocket of my folder. The school district formally notified 2 additional agencies, the county's Child Welfare Office and the state's Department of Education Compliance Division. I received written notification of both referrals on March 22nd, delivered by certified mail. My parents received their own notifications on the same date. Carol Hensley confirmed this in a follow-up call on March 24th at 2:30 p.m. My father called my cell phone 4 times between March 22nd and March 25th. I did not answer. My mother sent a text message on March 23rd at 9:47 p.m. It said, "We were trying to keep this family together. I hope one day you understand that." I read it once. I set my phone down on my desk. I did not reply. Daniel texted me separately on March 26th asking if I was okay. I said I was. He said he didn't understand what was happening, but that he was sorry. I told him it wasn't his to be sorry about. He was 14 and had been handed the same framework I had, that we helped because we loved, that the helping was its own reward, and he had not yet had reason to look at it from the outside. I also want to tell you about what my parents said at the kitchen table on the evening of March 23rd, because I think it is the most clarifying moment in the story, more than the conference room and more than the certified mail. I know what they said because B, who was 6 and whose capacity for holding information was more developed than they gave her credit for, repeated it to me later. My mother had said, "She'll calm down. She'll understand eventually that we needed her." My father had said, "She was always going to be fine. She just needed to see that." I have thought about those 2 sentences for years. They are a complete account of how this happened. Not from malice, not from a plan, but from a fundamental belief that my competence and reliability were not capacities that belonged to me, but conditions that belonged to the household. That my future was something they could draw on if necessary, like a line of credit, because they had assumed, had perhaps always assumed, that I would recover from whatever the withdrawal cost me. They were right that I would recover. They were wrong about everything else. I finished my junior year on time. I took the AP exams in May and received a 4 on AP Chemistry and a 5 on AP English Literature. My GPA at the end of the year was 3.91, 0.03 of a point lower than when the year began, the consequence of 2 missed weeks and parallel catch-up work. 0.03 of a point. That is what the interruption cost me academically. I say this not because it is triumphant, but because it is honest. Some things cost more than they should. Some things cost less than you feared. That one cost 0.03 of a point for weeks of my life and a quality of trust in the people who were supposed to be on my side that I have never fully recovered. And I think it is important to account for all of those things together rather than selecting the one that makes the cleanest ending. I applied to the early college program in the fall of my senior year. Ms. Odom wrote me a second letter of recommendation. This one she showed me before she mailed it, which she said she did not always do but thought, in this case, I had earned the right to see. It was 2 pages. It used the phrase "demonstrated resilience" in a way that made it mean more than the general use of the word, and I appreciated that she understood the difference. I was accepted to the program in November and began taking credited university courses in January of my senior year. I paid nothing for them. The credits transferred. I graduated from high school in June and enrolled in the university the following fall on a merit scholarship that covered $14,200 of my first-year costs. I moved out of my parents' house at 17, in the August before I started university, into a room in a subsidized housing arrangement that my Aunt Rosa had helped me find. I paid $437 per month, derived from my part-time library job at $13.25 an hour, 18 hours a week, and a realistic assessment of what I could sustain. I want you to know that number because round numbers are not how real life works, and this is a real life. The district's formal investigative process concluded 14 months after the file was opened. I am not able to tell you all of the details of the outcome because some of them remain confidential to the parties involved, and because the matter with the county's Child Welfare Office extended beyond the scope of the school district's jurisdiction and has its own timeline. What I can tell you is this: a formal finding of document fraud was entered into the district's records. It is documented. It is real. My re-enrollment was treated as a correction of an unlawful action rather than a courtesy, which matters procedurally in ways I will not detail, but that felt significant to me when Carol Hensley explained it. I have not spoken to my parents at length since I moved out. I have seen them at family gatherings, 2 of them in the years since, where the occasion made absence more complicated than attendance, and we have spoken in the polite, compressed way of people who share a history they have agreed, by unspoken mutual arrangement, not to open in public. My mother looks older. My father looks the same. Daniel calls me every few weeks. B is 12 now and sends me voice messages about things that are happening at school, and I listen to all of them and respond to most of them because she is 12 and she is not responsible for the household she was born into any more than I was. There is something I have thought about often in the years since that spring, and I want to say it plainly before I close. What my parents did was not a crime of cruelty in the traditional sense. They did not hate me. They were not trying to ruin me. They were trying, from inside their own limited, pressured understanding of their situation, to solve a problem. The problem was that they needed more than they had, and I was there, and I had always given what I had, and they had come to believe, through years of that giving, that what I had was theirs to allocate. That is not love. It is a category error about what a person is. Some things cannot be signed away on your behalf. It turns out that is not just a principle, it is also, specifically, the law. And the law, when you give it the right documentation in a well-labeled manila folder, is capable of moving with a precision and permanence that human arguments cannot always achieve. I make coffee now in a small apartment that is mine. I have a plant on the windowsill, a pothos Rosa gave me as a housewarming gift, kept alive for 3 years by the reliable method of not overthinking it. On the wall above my desk is the note Ms. Odom handed me in the hallway that Thursday morning in March. You have not missed anything you cannot recover, in a frame I bought for $4 at a thrift store. I look at it on mornings when I need to remember that some people in positions of authority use that position to hold a door open rather than close one. That is what I have to say about that. Before I go, one thing for you, because I think it may be useful wherever you are. Researchers who study parentification, the formal clinical term for the assignment of adult caregiving roles to a minor child, note consistently that one of its most corrosive effects is not the labor itself, but what the labor does to a child's sense of narrative ownership. The child stops being a person with a trajectory and becomes a function within someone else's timeline. One of the most documented elements of recovery, across multiple longitudinal studies, is the reconstruction of a personal timeline, not the family's account of events, but the individual's own record of what they were building, what they earned, what was taken, and what they reclaimed. The specificity matters. The dates matter. The documentation matters. I built mine in a manila folder at a library 4 blocks from my childhood home, for a combined cost of $1.26. If you are somewhere right now recognizing something in this story, if you are sitting with the particular feeling of a person who has been treated as a resource rather than a person, I want you to know that the reconstruction can start small. It can start with a phone note at 2:21 p.m. It can start with one date written at the top of a clean page. If you were in Lena's position, sitting across that conference table, with your documents and your bus ticket and the backward L that they had missed, would you have let the process speak for itself, quietly, the way she did? Or would you have confronted them directly, that same night in February, with everything you had? I know which one I chose. I know what it gave me. This channel features first-person narrative stories exploring family dynamics, personal boundaries, and the long-term consequences of loyalty and betrayal. Names and identifying details have been changed to protect privacy.